There are several techniques to storytelling that most would argue is an absolute must in order for a story to be good. But as a man who's actually written books, I can safely say that any true expert on this subject, which I'll freely admit I am not, will say that a more accurate statement is that a true genius is one who knows when it's better to break the rules rather than just blindly follow them all the time. And one of the most notable examples of that is what's known as the unseen character. The audience may only hear their voice, and sometimes not even that, but either way the viewer never actually gets to see this person and is only aware of their existence and what they're like through the other characters, which goes directly against the common phrase, show don't tell. Because when done right, such a character can easily become one of the best in a story despite never appearing on screen. However, an often overlooked aspect of them is that they can actually cause many unforeseen problems if not handled very carefully, and can sometimes end up working against the story because of that. And today, I'd like to go over a few examples of the unseen character in order to demonstrate why, from a fair and objective standpoint, it's one that shouldn't be used too often unless it's absolutely necessary. And spoilers are free game for anything I bring up ahead, so in case there's something you've been meaning to see and don't want to know the ending to, you might just want to be on the lookout. You have been warned. Okay, so just to clarify one thing right off the bat, this video is only referring to important characters that actually have narrative significance. If the unseen character in question is simply a delivery man, or has one scene talking to somebody on the phone that doesn't affect the story, then they don't count for the purposes of this video. Nor are characters who might be talked about frequently but don't actually factor into the plot, as pretty much any story will have such characters. This is only about characters that the viewer would expect to see, who have major relevance to the story and actually affect the plot but are never seen by the audience. And to give an example of such a character done right, there's of course Man from Bambi. Because first of all, the movie is about animals living in the wild, so it does make sense in a thematic sense to never actually show any humans they might come across. But even more than that, humans are notably completely alien to animals. They have no comprehension of what people actually are, hence why most animals are afraid of us. So as a result, never showing Man and instead only the immense dread and chaos that comes with his presence does a really good job of conveying to the viewer how animals perceive something so totally foreign to them. And there's also the reason Walt Disney himself decided that Man should never be shown, which is that the character is ultimately meant to represent the alien and inevitable evil that animals have to reckon with. So to give a face to such an evil would heavily take away from the impact of the character. So due to all of these different factors, pretty much anybody can agree that the decision to keep Man off screen was most definitely for the best, as it was really the only way to have him come across the way he needed to in a visual medium. And the fact that he's gone on to be one of the most memorable and acclaimed villains in cinema history only proves that. Because not only does he perfectly convey how such animals as birds and deer really perceive human beings, but the complete ambiguity of his character arguably makes him the most interesting in the entire film. Many a scholar has dedicated whole essays to Man's character and trying to figure out who he is, what's his motivation for hunting, and if he's actually a good person by human standards or not. Some have even questioned if he's actually a woman, or possibly even some kind of supernatural entity. And the fact that the narrative leaves very little clues about him only helps add fuel to the fire, because in the end there really is no answers to the questions most people have. This man is a total question mark, and had he been shown on screen, the mysterious quality that he evokes would be completely lost. Though what also helps him along immensely is, despite never being seen, he's the entire reason for the most infamous scene in the movie, and perhaps all of Disney history. He's the one who kills Bambi's mother, and not to mention sets up the entire climax by getting careless with his campfire. In other words, even though the character of Man is never shown, the consequences of his actions most definitely are, which only makes his character even better since it reinforces why he is most definitely the villain of the story. And that's an edge that man has to him that most other unseen characters don't, which is that the narrative is able to justify the other character's perception of him despite not getting to see him for themselves. Because as I explained in my video on unlikable characters, which you can find a link in the description to, ultimately it's what the audience sees above all else that influences how they judge any given character. You can tell the audience anything about what somebody has done, but it's what they see with their own eyes that's going to influence how they see a character the most. Like, for example, people tend to hate Dolores Umbridge in Harry Potter way more than Lord Voldemort, despite him being way worse, because Umbridge's insufferable nature is painstakingly depicted on page and screen over the course of an entire in-story year, thus giving the audience a million reasons to hate her based off her own actions by the time it's over. Whereas with Voldemort, most of his horrible deeds are done off screen and only conveyed after the fact. So the audience is less likely to hate him nearly as much, even if they still will most definitely view him as a terrible person. But if he were to have an entire book dedicated to depicting every single one of his most horrible crimes with as much detail as Umbridge got, it would basically be a guarantee that he would be the most hated of the two. Because again, it's what the audience sees in front of them that matters most, and very rarely will being told about an event have the same impact. And naturally, this can become a problem when an important character is never shown on screen, because again, while man's actions are still shown despite he himself not appearing, that's more the exception, not the rule, and as a result it can often lead to the audience perceiving things about them that the writer never intended. Like for example, in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Cameron's father is never shown on screen, but plenty is conveyed about him through both Ferris and Cameron himself. Specifically that he's an upper-class man who cares about his cars and wealth way more than his family, and constantly fights with his wife and ignores his son, which is what leads Cameron to be the nervous wreck that we see in the film. And, as is widely well known, because of Ferris, Karen ends up destroying his father's most prized car, but rather than find a way out of it, decides to confront him on what a terrible dad he's been, and this is portrayed as his ultimate triumph. Only, because the character is never shown, for many it doesn't quite come across that way. Because as I noted before, it's repeatedly stressed that Cameron is the way he is because of his father, and considering he has a meltdown over 175 miles being added to his car, as well as nearly having a heart attack over the mere thought of taking it out in the first place, it's pretty obvious that Cameron is terrified of him. And the problem here is that due to never seeing the source of his stress, his fear can be interpreted many different ways. Because on the one hand, Cameron may just be a worrywart by nature, and his parents' fighting and neglect may only make his anxiety worse. Heck, maybe he just hates yelling in general, and may just fear his father because he's always shouting. But on the other, it's also very possible, especially given Cameron's behavior, that his father is actively abusive towards him and isn't just neglectful, which would not only further explain his fear towards him, but also heavily call into question just what happened when he came home and saw what happened to his car. Because with so many different ways to interpret the character, he could have done anything from folded the moment Cameron actually stood up to him to killed his son in a fit of rage. So as a result, many don't view the ending as happily as they're clearly meant to, since it leaves Cameron's fate totally up in the air without offering even a hint that his father didn't do something horrible to him even with his newfound confidence. Now, of course, there is the fact that Ferris tells his girlfriend that he's sure Cameron will be alright, and one does have to question if he would have ever even considered taking the car out if he thought his father would have legitimately hurt him if something went wrong, as well as that he does offer to take the fall for Cameron after the car is destroyed. So all of this does hint at the fact that whatever did occur, Cameron did most likely get out of it alive with all of his limbs still functioning. But at the same time, Ferris doesn't prove himself to be the most reliable person. So as a result, many audience members aren't likely to take him for his word. To put it another way, had Cameron's father actually been shown on screen, it would have been a lot easier to convey the fact that he's a pompous jerk who doesn't care about his family, but also somebody incapable of grievous bodily harm even at his most angry, and thus would effortlessly be able to assure the audience that Cameron was ultimately fine no matter what happened. But with only the character's word to go on, and context clues surrounding Cameron's behavior, it does end up painting a much grimmer picture of both his father and what might have happened afterwards than John Hughes probably intended. And speaking of Ferris's unreliability, that's another problem when characters aren't shown on screen, that the viewer only has what the other characters say about them to go on, and it might not always be accurate at that, because as I discussed at length in my video on character perspectives, which you can also find a link in the description to, just because a character says or believes something, that doesn't mean they're always right. More often than not, something in the narrative needs to prove beyond a doubt that something a character says is correct. Otherwise, the audience might not believe them, or at least be suspicious. And considering one of the best ways to know anything about an unseen character is through other characters, then the narrative should make sure that it's coming from ones that the audience trusts. And case in point, in the Star Trek episode The Alternative Factor, the Enterprise crew run into a crazed man named Lazarus who's obsessed with catching a horrible monster and destroying him. Now nobody knows what this monster is, and have every reason to question Lazarus's sanity, considering how erratic he's behaving, but he won't stop talking about how this monster is an abomination that must be destroyed. But then towards the end of the episode, it turns out that this monster is actually Lazarus's antimatter doppelganger, and moreover is perfectly sane and a nice man who wants to save the universe from his psychotic counterpart, and in the end sacrifices himself to an eternity of misery in order to ensure that Lazarus's threat is neutralized. So in this case, the character's perspective of the unseen person in question was totally wrong, and even though one is likely to not take him at his word, there was still room for doubt, especially for a show like this. Or on the flip side, take the 1932 horror movie The Old Dark House, because the owners of the titular house quickly showed themselves to be a family of crazy people, with the youngest son only being the most sane by comparison. So as a result, near the end of the film when their older brother Saul escapes from his locked room, they stress how dangerous he is and that he must be killed. But when he actually appears, Saul appears to be nothing but a frightened old man unjustly held prisoner by his evil family, only to quickly show his true colors and is revealed to be exactly the psychotic lunatic that his family made him out to be. So in this case, even though the audience has every reason to suspect that the family might not be telling the truth, in the end it turns out that their claims about him were absolutely right. So now you might be wondering, what exactly is my point here? That both these examples demonstrate that when a character is unseen and has to rely on other characters to convey things about them, it can be difficult for the audience to take them at their word because they could be wrong about them just as much as they are right, especially if the viewer has reason to believe that the characters in question might be unreliable or biased. Because even if the character themselves believe that what they are saying is true, it may very well not be. As Lazarus most definitely shows. He wholeheartedly believes that his doppelganger is a horrible monster. He just happens to be totally wrong. And when these characters remain unseen the whole time, and thus never have a chance to prove these characters right or wrong, it can lead the audience to have a very warped perception of them because they don't know what to believe. That's why Man is a better example of this done right, because he himself is able to prove the other characters right about him despite never being shown on screen. But then there's also when people actively take advantage of an unseen character to make him out to be how they see him, even if the narrative doesn't support that view. And one of the best examples of that would have to be 1939's The Women. Because just like the play was based on, The Women features absolutely no on-screen male characters. Any and all men in the narrative are totally off-screen and are only talked about secondhand, with the closest any of them get to appearing being annoying telephone conversations where the audience only hears the woman's end. Now, the movie centers around a character named Mary Haynes, who's happily married until she finds out that her husband is having an affair with a gold-digging counter girl, Crystal Allen, and after much goading from her jealous and vampish cousin, divorces him, forcing him to marry his mistress to save face. But after 2 years, she finds out that he isn't happy in his new marriage at all and decides to win him back, taking advantage of the fact that Crystal holds loyalty to no one to ensure that she succeeds. But while this is presented as a happy ending, many take advantage of the fact that her husband Stephen never appears to paint a very different picture. But before I go any further, let me just stop and say that I do not encourage nor condone marital infidelity of any kind. I am not going to be defending the fact that Stephen cheated on his wife, simply that people go too far in vilifying him. So if you're going to use this video as an excuse to cheat on your spouse, don't. Because if you do, you're nothing but a spineless jerk who doesn't care for the feelings of the person you've promised yourself to. And that's on you. And if you can't commit, then don't. If you don't love them anymore, grow up and divorce them. I'm sorry for that. I just felt it had to be said so that nobody would take what I say next the wrong way. So to get back on topic, Stephen is wrong to cheat on Mary, most definitely. As I just got through saying, he is most definitely wrong for doing that, and the narrative treats it as such. However, certain people make him out to be this horrible, abusive jerk that's running around with every woman he meets behind his wife's back, and there's absolutely nothing in the narrative to support that view of him. Sure, having an affair was the wrong thing to do, but based off the way everybody talks about him, it's pretty easy to paint a picture of him as a nice and well-meaning gentleman who gave in to the advances of an attractive gold digger and found himself in over his head, which is still his own fault, yes. But the narrative never tries to say that it isn't. But it also doesn't try to make him out to be the most horrible person ever. As even in the midst of divorce, Mary still has only nice things to say about him. His daughter is shown to think the world of him, and everybody else who knows him speaks the same way, including Crystal herself. In other words, Stephen is clearly meant to be a flawed person who doesn't always make the best decisions, but in the end is still a decent person. But because he's never shown on screen and never gets to speak about the affair from his perspective, it's that much easier for people to imagine him in the worst light possible, with many even saying that Mary should have forgotten about him and that Stephen wasn't, quote, worth her time, even though, as I just noted, by all accounts he's actually regarded as somebody that most women would like to have as their husband. And once again, there's also the fact that there's a lot of context missing from the affair because things are never shown from his perspective. Because from the one scene we do have, Crystal is a very skilled emotional manipulator who's willing to say or do anything to get her fortune. So there's no telling how much he actually wanted to go through with it in the first place, nor if he ever intended on carrying it out for so long as he does. Who knows? Maybe she even started blackmailing him so that he'd keep giving her money. Now, many would argue this is most likely not to be the case, but it's honestly just as likely as him being a horrible person others try to say he is. Again, because we never get to see his side of the story, it's a lot easier to make assumptions about him. And as I explained in another video, which you can also find linked in the description too, people are a lot more likely to assume the worst. Except when it's a villainous character. Because, among other things, it's plainly stated that his marriage to Crystal is a totally miserable one, and moreover that he believes the woman he loved and lost no longer cares about him. And considering he suffered through this for 2 years, most would concede that that was more than enough justice for his affair, and that if he's really as good a person as he's made out to be by the narrative, then he does deserve a second chance if Mary's willing, which she is of her own initiative. I mean, the movie does show its age in quite a few ways, and the resolution definitely isn't perfect by today's standards. But the point is that to argue that Stephen didn't get punched with the consequences of his affair directly in the face is absolutely ridiculous. And once again, based off the way everybody talks about him, does seem to be worthy of Mary's desire to have him back. Again, the problem lies in the fact that because you never see him, it lets the imagination run wild with his character way more than was intended, and people do take advantage of that. And if you want proof of that, consider this. These same people take Mary's friend Peggy, who, as these people describe it, decides to divorce her husband and really wants to go through with it until she realizes she's pregnant. Now let me ask you this. This is Peggy on the train to Reno. Does that sound like a woman who really wants to go through with her divorce? Because if you actually watch the movie, one will know that in actuality, Peggy is happily married but very young and naive, and it's implied that her husband Johnny is the same way. But after being manipulated by, once again, the vampish and jealous Sylvia, she ends up getting into an argument with him and believes that her marriage is over because of it. But again, she clearly doesn't actually want it, and only doesn't go back because both of them are too stubborn to apologize. And it's only once they find out that she's pregnant that it pushes them to admit that they were being stupid and still love each other. In other words, the whole thing amounted to a young couple having their first fight and not knowing how to cope with it. But it was pretty much a guarantee that they were going to make up. Her being pregnant just made it easier. Because were their argument actually depicted, it's almost certain it wouldn't be nearly as bad as Peggy made it out to be, and was simply a quarrel that they blew way out of proportion, as young people are sometimes known to do. But the point here is, if these people will say things about a character like Peggy when it can clearly be disproven just by watching the film, what chance does a character like Steven, whom the audience never gets to see the perspective of or is allowed to speak his piece, have? Frankly, it's no wonder some go open season on him. He's the perfect target because he can't fight back. So, like I said before, obviously unseen characters do have their advantages and disadvantages, because when done right, like with Man in Bambi, it can make them the best character in the film and perfectly play their part in the narrative, as well as make the audience fascinated by them. But they can also invite widely different and unintended interpretations of them if they aren't handled carefully, or even invite people to totally warp the character, either intentionally or unintentionally, because they never actually get to see and experience them firsthand. Like I said at the beginning, it's definitely a character template that should be used very sparingly and only when absolutely necessary, because between the audience and the writing not always accounting for how they might view certain things, it's something that's very easy to get wrong. I mean, as a man who's written books, I totally get the appeal of such a character, but when it comes to ones that serve the plot in very important capacities, usually they're better off being seen, unless like Man in Bambi, there's a legitimate reason for them not to be. Okay, I think I've gone on about this for long enough. And if you're still here, thank you for listening to everything I had to say. But now let me hear from all of you. Do you believe that unseen characters are just rife for problems most of the time due to it being way too easy for the audience to draw the wrong conclusions from them? Or do you believe that they should honestly be used more often because it helps add to their mystery and intrigue? Please let me know in the comments below. And please understand that you are under no obligation to agree with anything I said in this video just because you watched it. You can feel about this or any other topic we discuss here, and if you happen to think I had it all wrong, that is totally fine. And thank you all for watching. I very greatly appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.